Hi, I'm Dylan and this is my brief video lecture on sexism in gaming. The purpose of this lecture is to summarize research relating to how and why sexism is occurring in video game culture. In presenting this, I'm assuming that you've completed the class Psychology of Gender, but if you're unfamiliar with some of these terms, you can pause on this slide. To break down the topic, I'll be first looking at the problem definition, then I'll be looking at contributing factors, theoretical frameworks, proposed solutions, and finally I'll be addressing some limitations and directions for future research. First, I'm going to give an overview of where sexism can be seen within gaming culture, and I'll be looking at both sexist behaviours and attitudes. Within the gaming community, there's this problem of males harassing female players. The first study here was an exploratory content analysis of various gaming media, and it highlighted the tendency for sexism to be either addressed as misunderstood, so people would claim it was just a joke, or they would claim it's something that just everyone has to deal with in gaming culture. However, if you look into the literature and how the harassment is often experienced, it specifically targets women. The first example here shows how sexualized content can prime thoughts that lead to women being objectified or increase self-reported tendencies for males to sexually harass. Women in gaming suggested that revealing their gender, be it by username or voice, they expose themselves to having their competency questioned and they're sexually propositioned by male gamers. The last experimental study here reinforces that. When they used pre-recorded voices in live online environments, the female voice elicited 3 times as many negative comments from male players. What's clear is that there's an attitudinal difference towards women that leads to a different type of harassment that's leading to these evident examples of hostile sexism. Here I've congregated several studies that highlight what these attitudes might be. All tend to agree that it's the way women are represented in games that has contributed to sexist attitudes that may be informing sexist behaviour. These first 2 examples suggest exposure to video games that portray women in stereotypical roles can increase endorsement in benevolent sexism, stereotypical gender roles, and sexual harassment, compared to viewing non-stereotyped characters. Additionally, when players witness sexual violence towards female characters in games, this can increase acceptance of rape myths, reduce empathy towards female victims, and increase endorsement of masculine beliefs. As indicated in the figure on the right, players who identify with male characters who commit sexually violent acts are more likely to endorse masculine beliefs, such as it's okay for a guy to use any means to convince a girl to have sex, which subsequently mediated whether they felt empathy towards female victims. While these studies might suggest sexist attitudes are circumstantially endorsed in players who engage with stereotypical and sexually violent content, as I'll highlight in the next section, such content is quite prevalent, so it's definitely worth reflecting on these attitudinal impacts. To get a sense of how far this can go, I think Gamergate was one of the most high-profile cases of sexism in gaming. Gamergate, if you haven't heard of it, was a harassment campaign that targeted several high-profile women in the gaming industry who were trying to draw attention to sexism and inequality. This qualitative study by Heron, Balford and Goka conducted a content analysis of online logs from 2 of the most high-profile attacks on women who endorsed feminist campaigns to address sexism. What they found was that these cybermobs perceived drawing attention to sexism as a disruptive attack on the masculine norms of the gaming community, and they responded with highly coordinated attacks against those seen as female leaders. Some similarities in the content analysed were tactics such as exposing sexual history, leaking nude images, revealing personal information, and death and rape threats aimed at coercing these women to cease their activism. Additionally, words such as those shown here, which I'm going to avoid saying, come up more than in common English comparisons. What was made clear in this analysis of these attacks was that the tactics and language used reflects overtly hostile and sexist beliefs, which factions of the gaming audience use to single out female gamers specifically and protect the culture from progressive values. Next up, we've got contributing factors. Here we're asking why is it that gaming in particular has developed this culture of sexism, and to answer this we're going to look at 2 trends in the research. The first trend is the focus on video game content, which I touched upon earlier as having a significant effect on the attitudes of gamers. Aspects such as gameplay, characters, and target audience are contributing to a stereotype that gaming is a male space and female players are forced into a marginalized position. Women are highly underrepresented, as only 10% of primary characters are female. When women are presented in games, they are often hypersexualized, have unrealistic body images, shown partially nude or with inappropriate clothing. As you can see in the table on the right, while men are more typically portrayed as muscular and powerful, women are painted as sexy, attractive, helpless, and innocent. The perpetuation of gender stereotypes, along with the increased availability of sexually violent content, such as portrayals of women being beaten or raped, are likely to be harmful. As we established earlier, that type of content is what feeds these sexist attitudes. While looking at content is important, and it has been shown to have significant effects on the attitudes of gamers, we also need to consider why sexism is so able to be openly expressed in gaming culture. This is where researchers highlight the role of the social environment. Because gaming has been historically male-dominated, personality variables such as social dominance and conformity to masculine norms have been highlighted as predictors of sexist beliefs. Within gaming culture, there's this hypermasculine discourse that reinforces the masculine gamer identity and leads to expressions of femininity being met with hostility. Salter and Blodgett argue that norms such as using rape to refer to victory and making jokes about female gamers not existing minimizes their experience and restricts them to being thought of as either sex objects, invisible, or as the enemy. Additionally, aspects such as online anonymity contribute to whether people are willing to act out these beliefs in hostile sexism. And then there's the impact of many games taking place in a competitive environment. When women enter what is perceived to be the domain of men and outperform them, lower performing males may perceive this as a threat to their social hierarchy status and be more likely to lash out against female players. As seen in the graph which compares kills as a measure of performance with negative comments, you can see far more negative comments by poor performing males are directed at females. So rather than thinking of content and environment as opposing contributors, perhaps it would be useful to think about how attitudes are fostered in content and then why the social environment allows them to be expressed. Now I think it would be useful to consider some theories that might help explain the mechanisms by which these factors contribute to sexism. The first is expectation states theory, which explores how social hierarchies occur within social groups. It claims that aside from observable skill, people use status characteristics such as age, race, or sex to predict how others are going to behave. They use these cues to form an expectation of someone's competence and situate them within a status hierarchy, which then determines how they're expected to behave. When people act outside the bounds of their social position, they're socially punished. Similarly to how you might imagine this could be applied to modern workplace settings, it can be applied to video games. Because they have been stereotypically seen as a male-dominated space, women are perceived as less competent in that setting and are therefore expected to be submissive towards those with higher social status, and men are seen as competent so they are allowed more influence and can be socially dominant. I think this is relevant to the findings such as those about women's competency being questioned and hypermasculinity being used to exclude women and then being targeted by lower skilled males in competitive settings, as these are examples of women being punished for stepping outside the expectations of a low hierarchical position. Next, we've got the social identity model of de-individuation effects, which provides an explanation for the effects of anonymity and group identity on individual behavior. Previous models of de-individuation suggest that in anonymous online situations, the lack of social cues causes a loss of self-awareness that allows for irrational and anti-normative behavior. However, what this model adds to this is the effect of salient group norms, whereby individual behavior is guided by identification with a group identity. It claims that people experience depersonalization, which refers to the change to defining themselves as part of a group. As a result, their behavior becomes less guided by individual identity, and rather they adopt stereotypical group traits and behavioral norms. This differs from simple de-individuation as it's seen as a rational group behavior rather than anti-normative. A consequence is that outgroups are perceived as more stereotypical and if they're seen as less dominant, then their group expression can be suppressed. To apply this to gaming, it's not just a matter of males being disinhibited so they act out. It could be because they are anonymous, they move away from their individual identity and defer to their masculine group identity to guide their behavior, which would explain the prevalent hypermasculinity and masculine norms, as females are seen as the outgroup and are subsequently suppressed and stereotyped by the dominant male group. Finally, we've got cultivation theory, the aim of which is to explain the effects of media content on cultural beliefs, and while it's theorized around television, it's arguably quite applicable to the study of video game content. The premise is that over time, our perceptions of social reality become more similar to the messages we are exposed to in the media content. And more similar content is consumed, the more reinforced our attitudes and beliefs become, which is used to explain why people are drawn to content that aligns with their own worldview. While it has been criticized for its simplicity, it's perhaps a theory worth considering regarding how the history of male dominance in game content has created a social reality perceived in gaming as a male space. Furthermore, it can be used to explain why exposure to sexually violent and stereotyped content has fostered attitudes and schema that justify the exclusion and harassment of female gamers. Now that we have an understanding of what's occurring and why, I'm going to present some of the proposed solutions. Something alluded to in much of the literature is this expectation for women to just deal with the gaming culture as it is. Coate here ran with this and asked the question, okay, so what is it women are doing to cope, and is it likely to be effective? What was found was that women are reporting having been excluded or targeted because of their sex, and to avoid this, they're doing things such as withdrawing from the game, playing either offline or only with friends, gender bending by changing their username or player character to a male one. They might use their skills or experience to deflect negative comments, or in some cases they adopt masculine norms by being a dick back to the guys who are harassing them. The problem highlighted here was that yes, these coping strategies may allow women to better navigate the gaming culture and minimize their experience of harassment. However, such strategies only limit how involved they can be, and as predicted by the expectation states theory, if they're acting out of line with their assigned position in the hierarchy, it might provoke further harassment and continued treatment as an outsider. What this suggests is that women shouldn't be made to just deal with it, but rather something needs to be done from the top down to address cultural problems. One option would be for change to occur within the community. Some groups, such as the one examined in the first study here, have taken it upon themselves to address the hypermasculinity by policing the language used by their members. What was observed was that by simply changing the language and norms used to communicate, women felt more welcome and empowered to participate in the gaming community. Another example of community-based change is the Women Are Too Hard to Animate scandal, which came about when a large game developer said they didn't include playable female characters because they lacked the resources, which really just emphasized the bias of placing male characters as a priority. What Huntsman points out, however, is how social media was used to challenge the status quo, which actually resulted in the developer changing their stance and including playable female characters in subsequent titles. As seen in the image on the right, there are a range of factors that contribute to whether women will self-identify as a gamer. However, most significantly, this study highlighted the effect of male discrimination and close relationships with other women as preventing women from identifying as gamers. What this highlights is not only are women not accepted by males in gaming culture, but by identifying as a gamer, they're seen to go against gender norms by other females. This suggests there's a need for a cultural shift in the principles of what it means to be a gamer. Such solutions, if looked at through the lens of the social identity model of de-individuation effects, could be effective as they look to change the dominant group identity that gamers engage with. By advocating for a strong gamer identity, women may less likely be stereotyped and seen as an outgroup. According to women in the industry, this male dominance of gaming starts at the top. Even though the video game industry is hard to break into in the first place, women face extra barriers that need to be addressed, such as the perception that they're not interested in making games, a boys' club mentality, and the difficulties of crunch time, which refers to the tendency for employees to be expected to work up to 70 hours in a week to meet deadlines. While this is a huge concern in the industry, women face the extra difficulty of such long hours conflicting with other expected gender roles, such as being a mother. Another consideration would be to consider what women want in relatable female characters. Attributes such as strong personalities, more diverse appearances, and meaningful backgrounds are things that researchers highlighted. By combating stereotypes, developers would not only create space for women in the gamer identity, but they would reduce the harm done in creating sexist attitudes. Finally, a factor that has been found to mediate whether women withdraw from gaming is perceived organizational responsiveness, which refers to the extent to which people believe developers are taking steps to combat sexism in the community. So perhaps having a more transparent and effective recourse for players experiencing harassment is a way that the industry could protect female gamers. Just quickly, I'd like to go over some limitations and possible directions for future research. So the current research is limited by the fact that many studies are correlational, making it hard to attribute cause, and those that are experimental don't really have any follow-up studies, so it's hard to say if they're externally valid. There's also a lack of consistent measures of video game sexism, and there's limited testing of possible solutions, and they also don't really consider how social environment and content might interact. Taking this into account, some possible research questions could be: how does sexual violent content influence communication in competitive online games? How does higher organizational responsiveness decrease the amount of harassment in online games? And does exposure to stereotype content produce lasting effects on sexist attitudes? Some key points to take away are that both explicit harassment and sexist attitudes are prevalent in gaming culture, and this can be attributed to video game content factors and aspects of the social environment. You can use various theoretical frameworks to explain why male identity is privileged in this culture, and individual coping strategies are likely to be ineffective, and there's kind of a need for community and industry action to make the gaming culture more inclusive.